So thank you for joining me tonight. As you know, I'm here to talk about my current research, which explores the effect that reading in a foreign language can have on younger learners, with particular regard to creativity, empathy, and motivation. So I'll talk about what these qualities are this evening and why they're necessary in general, but especially why learning a foreign language and how reading, particularly picture books, can help develop these skills. So hopefully by the end of the talk, you'll come away with some ideas that you can use in language lessons if you're a teacher with younger learners, or just learn a little bit more about the theories behind my research. So to start, I'm going to show you these 3 reading texts which are taken from my research. They've been stripped from their original layout to make this task I'm going to give you now a little bit less obvious, but I'd like you in the chat to suggest ways in which you think they're similar, ways in which you think they're different, and it will hopefully provide a bit of an insight into what I'm looking at in my research. And as you're doing that, I can tell you a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of what I'm doing. So to explain the project, I've recruited 5 primary schools in England, and they've all got 3-form entry. And over 2 full terms, so spring and summer terms, I've asked them to incorporate 20 minutes a week of reading and then some reading activities into their French lessons. It's not the only thing they're doing, but it is a good part of what they're doing. And each of the 3 classes is studying a different genre of text, which are represented here in these extracts. And in many ways, they're all very similar. Don't know whether any of you have any suggestions. Can't see, so I'll keep going. Oop. Food, yes. The topic is one thing. I know I'm going to make you hungry by the time we finish. But yeah, they're control for subject content, so they're all reading about the same thing. The language difficulty, the length of what they read is the same. And what you can't see here, but what is the case, is that they're all illustrated, so to help comprehension. Now, how are they different? Well done if you spotted that the one on the left is from a picture book. The second one is from a news website, a French news website, and the final one is from your average textbook. So if I show you here, these are where I've taken them from. So in my research, 1 class in a school will study the fiction, 1 does non-fiction, and the 3rd just acts as a control, and they use their usual reading text from their textbook or equivalent. The teachers in the project are given ready-made resources to use with these classes, in a sense to help control for what goes on in there. And the text is recorded by a native speaker. And the activities that follow lead children first to understand the text and then form ideas about it, share ideas, and be a little bit creative. And between the fiction and the non-fiction, the activities are identical. So that's controlled as well. And here, just to give you an idea of the sort of text we're looking at, is an overview of what we're doing. They're spaced out throughout the spring and the summer terms. And you'll see that the first 4 lines are actually very much linked to the calendar. So we start with King's Day, which in France, where they share a cake, it's on the 6th of January. And in England, World Book Day is a huge deal. Lots of kids come up dressed as their favourite characters. So you'll see that Tu lis où and the benefits of reading are kind of around March time when that would be. The other things, the other 4 are not related to the calendar. They're just more independent. All the texts, just so you know, are about kind of 100 words long, 150 words long. So similar to what year 5 will be doing from their textbook reading. For those of you who know French picture books, I'm sure you will certainly recognize a lot of these titles. But crucially, I don't think English children will. They won't have been exposed to these texts. They don't know the story already, which is important. So there's a genuine gap in understanding, or a kind of a need to read. So here, just to tell you about the study design, it's a quasi-experimental study rather than a true experimental study, in that I'm not able, going into schools, to distribute pupils randomly into groups. I mean, that is typical in this type of research, where it's not possible to disrupt those classes. So that's how it is. That's why it's a quasi-experimental study. A mixed method means that I'm using both quantitative and qualitative data. So for quantitative, the pupils who are in this study have already been given their pre-tests to measure French vocabulary, motivation, creativity, and empathy. And I've very briefly stated how I've done that on the slide. All will be measured again at post-test, so maybe in 3 weeks, I think we're going to do it, and then at delayed post-test to see if there are any effects, if they are lasting effects or not. So if you want to know a bit more about how I did this, perhaps that's a question for the end of the talk. At the minute, because I only have the pre-test data, I can't really tell you much about that, but keep an eye out for when I do get further results. But through the talk right now, I can sprinkle some qualitative data from findings from classroom observations, looking at pupil work, and from comments that the teachers have told me. So I'll keep going. So that's an overview of the nuts and bolts of the research. And what I propose to do now is talk a bit more in detail, look at the concepts I'm investigating. So vocabulary first, then empathy, creativity, and motivation. Define what they are, say why they're useful for young language learners, why we might want to encourage these things, and then give potential ways to incorporate them into lessons nicely and easily. So why reading at all? Why not songs or speaking? Well, in practice, that in England, we know that picture books are used by lots of primary teachers to support second language learning and to engage learners. And we know this because lots of resources are shared on online groups. It's a regular topic of webinars like this. There's lots of training you can get. And that's probably because there's something special about picture books that can have a big effect of pupils in lessons. Teachers see this, and that's important. We need resources, especially in England, that pack a punch, because pupils aren't really exposed to much foreign language in school. They have maybe 30 to 60 minutes a week if they're lucky. So teachers need resources that can do some heavy lifting in the time they have available. So establishing evidence to support whether picture books do in fact have these tangible benefits. They're used, but can we prove why they work? That's important. And theory suggests that it might be because picture books include a rich range of formulaic expressions and lots of repetition, lots of rhyme. You get lots of emotions, not just positive, often negative. And children can read them both individually and they can share them in groups. So they can make, that all gives them a possibility to make emotional connections to characters, storylines. They can empathize with characters. They can have creative responses to stories. And this in turn can be motivating to want to hear the story again, and therefore increasing exposure to the language and having a kind of virtuous learning circle, which we want to try and create. And I would argue that intercultural understanding is key in this. From slightly older children, not sort of the 9-10-year-olds I'm looking at, and their motivation to learn a language is strongly linked to their belief in the importance of interacting with people from countries, from the country they're learning about. So school twinning, pen pals, exchanges, these are all necessary, but teachers will know that they take up a lot of time, and just on a regular basis, it's just not feasible. What is more feasible is interaction with the country by proxy, maybe through the second language culture. So things like videos, literature, music. And a study in terms of the literature, a study of early secondary school learners, so again, a little bit older, showed, unsurprisingly, that they are more engaged by reading interesting, good quality books rather than their normal textbooks. And the reason could be because of the opportunities these books provide on an emotional, intercultural level, and then showing empathy and creativity within them. And also the fact that it's important to show a range of emotions within these books. The challenge we have is making these texts, even if they are for younger children, making them accessible to early stage learners who don't have as developed linguistic skills. And as parents state, the way we do that, what could be a determining factor, is how we do that in lessons. And that's what my research project with its ready-made resources aims to help teachers to do. So if I move on, we're going to talk first about vocabulary, and I can explain what I mean by making the text more accessible at the beginning. So obviously, children need lots of quality input, and the Reading the Picture books can provide this. And picture books, because they're illustrated, the pictures help act as a bridge for young beginner learners to access this quality input. And I would say, even with that, you couldn't just put a book in a child's hand and expect them to be able to read it and understand it. You would need, as a teacher, to explicitly teach a little bit, and that's what we do in the project at first, to give them hooks and ideas as to what to look out for in the text. However, once that's done, incidental learning could, with picture books, take place. Probably because of the way picture books help children notice words as they go. So we see here we've got the little bunny. It's about colours, and the children know this because the title is Toutes les couleurs. So they'll know that vert is green because it's coloured green. They'll know that derrière is probably his bottom because that's what's green in the picture. So things that help them notice. And the children in my pilot scheme really enjoyed the picture we see of the bunny being jealous of the girl he likes being kissed, and then they made the point that they found the words being kind of bigger or smaller really helpful to aid understanding, and picture books just do that naturally. Thirdly, with multimodal input, picture books can be quite expensive, especially for schools. You know, you would need a range of them. But they are mostly available online on different social media platforms for free. And that's a really great way. They're often read by actors and who can kind of bring out the emotional qualities, the dynamics in the text. And that too can help children understand what's going on. So once we've had this linguistic understanding, then we can look to develop other types of understanding. So we're going to start with empathy, which is a psychological term, and it's grown into kind of a multidimensional construct. But broadly speaking, it means recognizing and identifying with and acting upon someone else's feelings and emotions. It's fundamental to social interaction. It helps our own sense of well-being, and it helps us connect with others. There is a genetic element to empathy, and depending on what study you are reading, it ranges from about 30% to 50%. So you do get pupils, you do get people generally who are naturally more empathetic than others. However, there is a big range which is teachable. So it's a useful skill to develop in schools. And we can see here why we might want to do this in schools. It lessens aggressions, it improves social competence, creates a bit more harmony while people are learning. And within psychology, the different facets of empathy tend to be defined as cognitive empathy, affective empathy, and behavioural empathy. So I'm just going to kind of say how this might relate to picture books. Because cognitive empathy, if we start with that, is recognising, understanding another person's mental state by imagining their feelings, recognising their emotions. And that is similar to comprehending perspectives and identifying with characters in literature, which is potentially why literature and stories are a particularly powerful way to help develop empathy. Generally speaking, there's quite a lot of research that's found that reading fiction develops empathy because we're identifying with characters and people of lots of different types. So cognitive empathy is about giving somebody tools to recognize emotions, words to recognize emotions. Whereas affective empathy refers to a mirroring of another's emotional response. So it's that feeling that you get when you're watching a film and you're crying and you turn around and somebody else is crying, or you're laughing and the laughter gets kind of passed around the room. And it can be carried by non-linguistic cues such as facial expressions, tone, body language. And using picture books, like some of the pictures we've seen already, where these cues are made explicit in pictures, helps children to recognise those emotions and feel those feelings too, in spite of there being a potential language barrier. And the third ability here, so behavioural empathy, is used to describe a person's response to the cognitive or the affective empathy. So it's how people usefully turn these emotions or recognition of emotions into support. And fundamentally, for speakers of different languages, this sort of empathy can potentially be a catalyst to cross that language barrier and attempt communication, even if you don't know a lot of the other language. So we've got to care enough to want to communicate with somebody else, and this sort of empathy can help that happen. Hoffman, if you know her work, makes a case for cultural empathy, or the recognition of similarities and differences between cultures. So people who speak another language might see the world differently from us, and recognizing that those similarities and differences are important. However, cultural empathy realizes as well that we all feel very similar things in spite of any cultural differences. We are all bound by a common humanity. So as cultural objects, picture books can help develop this too. So let's have a look at some practical examples that have worked very well in my research in developing empathy. The first is just naming it, and you'll hear the kind of phrase, name it to tame it. So in French, we've given them nouns as a starter before we've even shown them the book, and kind of primed them to think about what emotions might be involved when they're reading the text. So obviously you've got positive on one side, negative on the other. And for the Gala des Rois, so the King's Festival on the 6th of January, they didn't really know about this. They didn't know much about it. The picture was their only clue. But they were really good in the lessons I observed of, obviously, the picture's very positive, but also thinking of what might happen if you don't like the cake. You might be a bit, it could be le dégoût. Or what happens if you're not the person who finds the little toy in their slice? There's only one. You might get sad. You might feel a little bit of jealousy. And they were really good. They needed all those range of emotions to talk about this one pretty simple picture, really. And another thing that worked well was giving them adjectives, simply to give a basic response at the end of reading a text. So they were able to describe how they felt. And then they could apply those we kind of increased the range of adjectives they were able to use, so they could apply it to the characters they identified with as well. So naming some emotions, both with nouns and adjectives, works. Using the message of the book. So again, this is toutes les couleurs. And in the book, the little bunny has an amazing day where he is picking flowers, so his hands go yellow, jumping in puddles, so his feet are brown, his face is red because he's been eating strawberries. And then at the end of the day, he washes it all off and thinks about how nice it's been. So kind of applying that within the class to, well, what colour, what are the nice things that have happened to you? Would that have a colour? Where would it be on your body? Simply things like that. One thing you can't really get away from with picture books, I would argue, is animals. It's very commonplace, and it also, I think, from what I've observed, this is my theory, it helps children talk about emotions because it's not directly them. It can make them feel quite vulnerable, I think, when they're talking about their own experiences and how it makes it feel. But when they're talking about a fictional character, or a fictional character who also happens to be an animal, that pressure is relieved a little bit, and they can talk a bit more freely and a bit more safely about different emotions. And it's quite fun to include animals in there. They're very cute. And then a very direct way to do it, I would argue, this isn't a book that's in my research, because when I kind of took the pictures away, the actual text was just too complicated, which is not the impression you get when you read the book with the pictures. It's because of the speech bubbles, the children very easily see what is going on, and they can follow the quite clear pattern with the doctor and the patients. And so you can just lift that, and they can pretend to be the crocodile, and one of them can wear a little coat and pretend to be the doctor, or they can adapt it and pretend something else if they want. But the language is there for you to use ready-made, really. So that's quite a nice way to use picture books. So we're going to move on to creativity. And how does empathy relate to creativity? Well, in an awful lot of ways. There is a big overlap between the two, possibly because they both involve the imagination, and being able to imagine what someone else is feeling, what it must be like to be someone else. And they both involve seeing things from a different point of view, and being open-minded. And I would say that all these things are really strongly underpinned by a sense of being able to imagine the experiences and the feelings of others. And the relationship is expressed quite clearly in this quotation from researchers from the University of Cambridge. So they say that creativity and empathy possess similar traits, which we've acknowledged, where one is needed for the other to flourish. And resistance to closure here in this quote means being ready to see things differently, not having a fixed idea about things or people that you want to associate with. And so if we pass on now to general creativity, it can be defined as the ability to generate novel but suitable solutions to problems through cycles of convergent and divergent thinking. So being able to zoom out, zoom in a way that is useful for solving various problems. It encompasses various traits. Lots of different academics will kind of, if you look at Runco here, they're all kind of circling around these things. And if I move on to the next slide, to language learning, there is an established link between second language use and creativity. I'll come to how it might be a little bit weaker with the children I'm dealing with once I've explained key facets of creativity with language. So what I'm looking for when I'm testing creativity is fluency, so the ability to generate relevant responses quickly, which is obviously very important when you're speaking in languages. Originality, not just sticking to the set phrases, trying to say something a bit different, something that might be more relevant to you. Again, it's this resistance to premature closure, which I would argue is very important when learning a language, not having the blind panic when you don't understand everything, being okay with that, sticking on board, keeping going, being able to tolerate that feeling of not knowing. And then elaboration as well, kind of to keep a conversation going, you've got to make an effort. You can't, if you make a one-word answer, that's conversation finished. So being able to develop or embellish or throw the ball back, all kind of creative ways of using languages, which this is my supervisor, Suzanne Graham, who talks very well about creativity in languages. And this quote kind of reflects what we've just been talking about there. Now, the established link that I was mentioning between L2 use and creativity is very clear in bilinguals, especially balanced bilinguals. So not just linguistic creativity, but general creativity. Less clear with beginner learners, lower proficiency learners. I will say in my pilot study, it came through the group. I can't generalize very much with this because the numbers were so small, but the group who did study fiction did show a marked increase in creativity. So I've got my fingers crossed that something might happen, that there might be a link when the results come through. So thinking about how we can incorporate this into lessons, I think even just presenting language, you can do it a bit more creatively. Games are a good way. So this is the Stroop test, and we're kind of thinking about cognitive inhibition, not saying the first thing that just leaps into your mind. So the children here, they loved this game. the aim was to not say the word, but say the colour. And the slides changed quite quickly, and they had to pass a toy or whatever it is they had between. And if you were left holding the toy at the end of the game, that meant you lost. So it was all quite frantic. And they had to think on their feet and be fluent. So to say noir, not orange, and to say rouge and not noir. And it was a really fun game that they enjoyed. Another one that's useful and quite easy, I find, is rather than saying, these are the categories, could you put these items of vocab into the categories and tell me that you understand which ones are masculine, which ones are feminine, or whatever the categories tend to be. Switch it round. So if this is the vocab, what could the categories be? And it's really enlightening. They have to come up with a ton of ideas, or they do tend to come up with lots of different ideas about what might be going on in the language, how might we solve this problem. And it's very interesting for the teacher as well to listen to that and get an understanding of where they're at with the language. What's worked very well, we've done a couple of times on my project, is these word clouds. It's a bit 15 years ago. They were all over the place for a while. But what is nice when you're introducing texts is, especially when you've got it kind of online or in soft form, just put it into the word cloud very quickly, and it will come back out with the words that are used a lot bigger, and then the words that are used not so much, nice and small. So the children get a sense straight away of the topic, potentially. They can make a guess at that very easily. This one's about food as well. They can look to see whether it's a positive slant on it or a negative slant. You know, what other words would give those clues? They can look for words they know. They can look for words that are cognates. And what we did was get them to pick a couple of words, 2 or 3, and they had to, and it was their choice, and they were the words that they were going to try and spot through the text when they did eventually come to read it and listen to it. And they had to do little actions and stuff and react when they saw those things. So it's good at keeping them engaged. But all those ideas came from those seeing the text, not necessarily in the right order, but it gave them a really good way in and primed them to read the proper text. Okay, and another thing that has come out, which I didn't necessarily expect, is drawing. And as a teacher, I maybe avoided it because I didn't see the linguistic point in doing it necessarily. It's really enjoyable, yes, but we don't have that much time, and it takes time. However, there are ways of doing it which can be quick. So for one thing, the king's cake again, the little toy that is hidden. For those of you who know the festival, the fun thing is that it could be anything. And so they had to design their own fève or toy, and they would pick the parameters of what they were going to do. So they pick the colour, they pick the emotion, they pick the size, and then they come up, they have 3 minutes or whatever to draw their idea of what that fève could be. And this is one of them. So it's obviously they picked orange, and they picked surprise, and they picked not sure what size that would be. But yeah, they really, really enjoyed coming up with lots of ideas, seeing what their friends had come up with as well. So that's one way of doing it. Another one that worked well was once we'd read the book and seen the style that the author used, they looked at some of the titles, the other titles this author had done. So it was Stephanie Blake, and they matched them up with the English, and then they imagined what the cover for that same character in these different books might be. And one, for example, here, Je veux pas aller à l'école, was very similar to Stephanie Blake's version. It was kind of pretty spot on. Another one just made me laugh. Non, c'est pas juste, which if we compare it to the original, I feel like this could be the portrait in the attic, but the emotion and the energy that this child has put into their bunny, I think just shows how into the activity they were, and kind of how much they connected with this possible character. So it is worth doing if you have the time in your lessons. Oh, and another thing to say, for those children who find it a bit intimidating, having a blank page, not knowing what to do with it, kind of not wanting to get judged because they don't feel very confident. And there are lots of online tutorials in French. So this one was actually done by the author where they in 5 minutes, she kind of draws the bunny for you and you draw it along with her, and she kind of explains how she's doing it. So that there are various ways to kind of incorporate these drawings into the lessons. All of which leads to motivation, hopefully. If learners are more engaged emotionally, if they're challenged through creative tasks, they may well be more motivated. Now, obviously, motivation is important for many different skills that people have to learn that develop over a long period of time. So just reading in your own language or learning an instrument, becoming good at sport. And it's the study of why we do it, why we keep doing it, why we might stop. And it's important, especially in children of this age, because their learning process is so much slower than you get when they've got a more developed working memory a little bit later on. Keeping them motivated is important, and the fact that they have a bit less independence as well to kind of do their own thing, find what they're into. They're largely motivated by what happens in the classroom and what the teacher can do with them. So it's important to get it right. There's a bit more pressure, arguably, to get it right in the primary classroom. There are lots of theories for languages about motivation and why people are motivated, why they keep learning. And the one that underpins my research is self-determination theory, which you may well have heard of. It's a comprehensive theory of human motivation. It's been applied to many domains, so health, sport, work, and education, not just languages. Lots of different ages, which was important for my study as well, and different genders. And it posits that we have an inclination towards psychological growth and integration. And so for healthy development, we need support for our basic psychological needs, which are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And looking at these, if you've kind of seen them before, or if you're kind of thinking about them in terms of schooling, you'll see that the first two, I think, fit very well with schooling. That's competence is what we're there for. We're there to help children progress in their abilities and thrive on challenges and get positive feedback and grow. That's what schools do very well. And relatedness as well. In a good school, children do feel a sense of belonging. They have friends, they have these caring environments. Autonomy, I think, is difficult for schools just because of the amount of people who are in there, always being able to do what you want to do and support, pursue exactly what you want to do when you want to do it isn't always possible. So, but it is possible, arguably, to try and add elements of autonomy into lessons, which is important because thwarting, according to self-determination theory, thwarting any of these basic needs is detrimental to wellness and intrinsic motivation. An internal motivation or intrinsic motivation is the most effective driver of motivation, and it's driven by inherent interest or enjoyment, and fostering competence, relatedness, and autonomy leads to greater motivation and greater achievement because it fosters this intrinsic motivation. On the other side, attempts to control outcomes by extrinsic rewards or sanctions typically results in lower quality motivation and performance. So given this, how might we apply it to picture books in the classroom? Well, first off, the books are cultural objects, and learners who are interested in second language culture tend to show intrinsic motivation anyway. So getting them interested in these things is important. And I would argue that picture books can support these three psychological needs. Competence, it is a real sense of challenge in completing a book in French. The teacher is important helping the children do that, but they have to do it and they have to kind of put the work in so they get that feeling of competence. Relatedness, I think, works in a couple of ways. The children can relate both to fictional characters in the book that they can identify with or not, and they can also, in sharing this book, relate with other members of the class, so they can share their ideas, they can collaborate with them, all based around this picture book. And for autonomy, I think picture books can help in this sense. DeVela et al. State that specific classroom activities that involve a degree of autonomy are the most frequently mentioned sources of foreign language enjoyment, but it is still rare in the early stages of language learning to get that feeling of autonomy. However, once a child is familiar with a picture book, once the story has been introduced, I would argue children can decide what to read, how to read it, when to read it, especially if a school is lucky enough to have these physical books, they can do that. They can kind of go to the reading corner. They can take it home if they're allowed. But importantly, if they're given the links as well, the online links, they can share them at home too, and share them with different members of their family. So in this case, that can be a motivating factor for language learning. So here we go. To recap, we've considered tonight why picture books in particular have the potential to develop linguistic skills in young learners, as well as non-linguistic skills listed here. We've seen what creativity, motivation, and empathy look like, or can look like, in a languages classroom. And I hope you found some of the approaches and the activities I've suggested useful. I've summarised some of them here, but you may well wish to add your own to the chat. I'm hopeful that my research will provide useful resources and techniques for French teachers, both specialist teachers and non-specialists, to use in their classrooms, and that the results when they come in will help clarify and crystallise the benefits of using picture books with younger learners. So thank you very much.